In this episode, I'm once again joined by Dr. Ben Joffe, anthropologist and scholar practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. This episode is the third part of a series in which we explore Ben's PhD dissertation about the Ngakpa of the Himalayas, or as Ben calls them, wizards and socially engaged yogis. In this episode, we explore the realms of gender and sexual orientation in both textual and social contexts. Ben discusses the complex situation of female spiritual practitioners in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, looking at terms such as khandroma, dakini, and more. We learn about the role of a sangyum, or sexual consort, and find out why Ben's teacher and co-author, Dr Nida Chenagtsang, dedicated their book on sexual yoga to abuse victims, particularly those who have been abused in religious contexts. And finally, we discuss the heteronormative perspective of traditional tantric texts, and hear Ben's thoughts on how to practice these yogas in other orientations. So without further ado, Dr. Ben Joffe. Dr. Ben Joffe, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Continuing on from our previous conversation, and for those of you who may be tuning into this for the first time, this is a part of a series of conversations that Dr. Ben Joffe and I are having about his PhD dissertation. In the first episode, we met the scholar and we looked at Ben's life and his various influences and his trajectory into the field of anthropology, and specifically in the area that he worked. And we also looked at his methodology in terms of his research. In the second episode, we defined the Ngakpa. What are they? We looked at their magical powers, how they accumulate those, and told very interesting stories about sorcerers, battles, and so on. So it was terrific. And this time we're going to keep going sort of our steady march through the dissertation, chapter 3 for those of you who are following along at home. I want to kick off with some questions about gender, and you make some very interesting observations here. You discuss that Ngakma, or female Ngakpa, is a term that one would not usually hear, but instead terms such as khandroma, jetsuma, jomo, and so on are more frequently used. I'd like to ask you about those terms, particularly say khandroma. You write here, khandroma, skygoer, she who moves through space, is a complex, multivalent term, difficult to translate neatly into English. And I think listeners may be aware that it's a term often heard in the US and Europe in all kinds of contexts, including the New Age, Neo-Tantra circles. Can you give a sense of why Ngakma is not often used in Tibetan culture, and what is implied by those various other designations of honor given to female practitioners?
Sure. Well, let's see. I guess to respond to that, I would maybe call back. I hope viewers who aren't familiar with the previous interviews will forgive me for this, but I'll call back to our discussion about the term ngakpa previously, where I kind of laid out how you can look at ngakpa on two different levels, a kind of more inclusive, general level, where it sort of indicates someone who is a practitioner of highest yoga tantra, of secret mantra. If you look at the word itself, as we said before, ngakpa, it's a mantran. It's someone who uses mantras, or someone who uses tantra, someone who's been initiated into advanced tantric yogic practices, right? Then I laid out how, kind of in a more Tibetan historical cultural context, Ngakpa has a much more specific set of connotations. So it refers more particularly to a certain kind of religious ritual specialist, a kind of vocation, which, as I mentioned, is often hereditary and historically always patrilineal in its transmission. So, younger men inherited from older men as a kind of career or a kind of social status. And that's usually father to son or uncle to nephew. There are variations. So on that level, the word ngakpa sort of for native Tibetans invokes an incredibly masculine image. It's essentially a man's job, traditionally, historically. The village ngakpa, the word isn't incredibly masculinized in terms of the linguistics of it. Pa in Tibetan is kind of a nominalizer. It's like saying er as a suffix in English, so nga is mantra or tantra, and then the pa is kind of the tantricer. So it isn't inherently explicitly masculine, but I think it would be fair to say that if you say the word ngakpa, if you could do a kind of cognitive science study, get some native Tibetan speakers or Himalayan people in a room and sort of measure their immediate reactions or their internal responses to that word, I reckon that the stock image that would rise up when that word is uttered would be of a male practitioner. And I talk in the dissertation of how some Tibetans I chatted with, when they were talking about female tantric specialists, they kind of sometimes struggled themselves to find words to use. So I talk in the dissertation about one moment where I was talking to an old language teacher of mine, and she was telling me about a lifelong nun, a celibate nun, who was also a yogini. So she was a nun. She maintained vows of celibacy, but she also had spent decades in closed retreat. And to mark that fact, she had grown long dreaded hair. So she looked like a yogini. She looked like she had the same sort of external attributes of a ngakpa, but it never occurred to her to describe her as a ngakma because of several reasons. One, ngakpa, like I said, at that sort of ethnographic cultural level, usually means a village-based specialist who has a household and a kind of and holdings. You know, they've inherited ritual tools from their male relatives. They've inherited ritual status. They have a function in the village as a householder practitioner. This nun retreatant was not that. She from the moment she became a nun, she was not a householder. She didn't have a regular kind of lay family or the responsibilities of family life. And so it made more sense to refer to her as Anila, as a nun. But she wasn't like all other nuns because, indeed, she had these long dreadlocks and she had spent lots of time in retreat cultivating tantric power. So actually, in the course of this conversation, my friend referred to her as Ani Ngakpa, which just sounds strange, a little bit strange, because, like I said, unqualified, when you say Ngakpa to Tibetans, it often suggests a quintessentially male, and not only male, but a certain kind of masculinity, right? A certain expression, cultural expression of masculinity as part of this recognized religious role. And today you will hear both Tibetan teachers and Western teachers and practitioners refer to Ngakma. I would say that I think that Ngakma and Ngakmo, as feminizations of Ngakpa, are much more commonly found, like you mentioned in the quote, among non-heritage Buddhist practitioners, amongst non-Tibetans. My teacher, Dr Nida Chenagtsang, a Ngakpa from Tibet, he uses the term Ngakma. And, you know, the term is intelligible particularly to him because the community of tantric specialists that he comes from in Tibet has sort of, to a certain extent, blazed a trail in creating new spaces for female practitioners. So then I'll backtrack. You know, on the one hand, you could say that, well, let me say this. There's absolutely no ambiguity about the fact that female tantric practitioners have always been an essential front and a really important part of the Tibetan religious landscape. Right from the advent of Buddhism in Tibet, we see Padmasambhava coming as the quintessential ngakpa, as I mentioned before, into Tibet, performing the sort of activities of a great ngakpa. But how he does that is through his interactions with key female partners and collaborators. So many people are familiar with Yeshe Tsogyal, the royal woman who became his consort, the sort of old-fashioned term that's often used, his spiritual sexual yoga partner, and who actually becomes the first Tibetan in at least legendary history, first ethnic Tibetan to achieve enlightenment in one human lifetime, in one human body, through the practice of tantric yoga, through her partnership with her sexual yoga partner and personal guru, Padmasambhava. He is effectively unable to accomplish any of the important tasks he has to do as a tantric miracle worker in Tibet without her involvement. Yeshe Tsogyal is understood to be the one who helped him write down the Theravada teachings and then conceal them. They're entrusted to her in the same way that they're entrusted to Dakinis more generally, or khandroma more generally. So if you're just walking through a Tibetan village and you meet a ngakpa, a hereditary common garden variety village ngakpa, and then you meet his wife, it's quite common for her to be referred to by a kind of honorific title of khandra or khandroma. She might also be called sangyum, secret mother, which is the term used to designate her specifically as a sexual yoga consort. So there are always dakinis and always, or khandroma. Khandroma is the Tibetan, I should make that clear, the Tibetan translation of dakini. And there are always yoginis in this kind of religious landscape. But the idea that a woman could sort of occupy that cultural, social, everyday role as the hereditary village specialist, that's more of a new idea. Like I mentioned, in northeastern Tibet, in Rebgong, where Dr. Nida is from, since the 80s, there's been a really exponential growth in the wives of ngakpa from the community, asking to receive teachings, increasing their Tibetan literacy so that they can perform collective rituals alongside their husbands, so that they can, publicly wearing clothing or keeping their hair in a certain fashion, and sort of becoming involved in practices more with a bit more agency, and also with a bit more, in a more formal way, in a way that sort of mirrors more what their husbands and male relatives may have been doing. So I would say that part of the reason why Ngakma doesn't make sense to a lot of Tibetans, or historically hasn't done so, is because of this question of religious function and religious status. Now, aside from that, like I said, there have always been female yoginis, like that nun that I mentioned as an example. So yeah, I think what this comes down to a large extent, is sort of cultural precedence around the types of roles that men and women have been able to occupy. There have always been, in Tibetan and Himalayan societies, the possibilities for women to devote their lives to professionally to religious practice, either as nuns or as yoginis. And as yoginis, they may be partners to ngakpa, to non-celibate, non-monastic specialists, or they might be yoginis alone. They might especially eschew the attentions or desires of men. And, I think a lot of this has to do, part of the reason why we don't see ngakma kind of occupying an equivalent space or status historically in Tibet is because, more broadly in terms of gender roles, men and women haven't occupied the same spaces or haven't had access to opportunities in the same way when it comes to religious training, or just around expectations of what they could or should be doing. So, on one hand, male tantric yogis have depended on female practitioners. I mean, this is a word you often hear, temba, depend on, rely on, as part of spiritual practice. Female practitioners, in a way that, can sometimes feel a little unequal or exploitative. So in terms of sexual yoga practice, male practitioners may depend on female partners in those heterosexual spiritual practices involving actual penetrative heterosexual sex. But in a broader sense, male practitioners have also depended on women in other, maybe more sort of prosaic, less, exciting ways. As the mother of ngakpa's children, their wives and partners, take on responsibilities as cultural gender norms dictate, of taking care of children, of performing domestic labor, which in a way you could say enables the possibility for ngakpa to engage in extensive retreat. It creates the supportive sort of cultural, socioeconomic space in which male practitioners can kind of actualize their activities. So very simply, I would say ngakma has been gaining in currency as a term, ngakma, but it's been my experience that many Tibetans don't really even understand what you mean when you say ngakma as female ngakpa, because they've never met a female ngakpa. They immediately understand what you mean when you say khandroma or nenjoma, yogini or dakini. These are honorific titles, like I said, that are given to the spouses or sexual yoga partners of yogis. But there are also terms that could be given to really any woman who exhibits exceptional spiritual capacities or who is engaging in tantric yoga. So there are khandros or khandromas who are nuns and are not simply sex partners to male yogis. So the term khandroma and dakini has a kind of very broad semantic field. As you mentioned, it's sort of migrated into neo-tantric, New Age contexts where, at least from my experiences in the South African neo-tantric community, which is surprisingly active, Daka and Dakini, which are terms from Vajrayana, which refer to, and this is where things get interesting because we're talking about tantric traditions here, where things operate on different levels, sometimes simultaneously. So in kind of Tibetan cosmology, khandroma is a pretty general term. It's often translated as sky goer or sky dancer. Literally, ka means sky or space, ndro means to move through, and ma is a feminization. So it's any female potency or being which moves through space. And so now the level at which you understand that term, there are several. So there are worldly spirits in Tibetan cosmologies, unenlightened spirits, sort of ordinary demonesses that are called khandroma. Sometimes they're called, one of the terms used is shasa, so like meat-eating khandroma, flesh-eating khandroma often is this appellation that's used to refer to khandroma who are kind of more like unruly female aerial spirits that tantric practitioners can engage with, but that can also cause problems. They can cause, they can afflict human beings and they need to be exorcised. Then there are Yeshi khandroma. There are enlightened primordial wisdom khandros who are essentially expressions of Buddha activity, of enlightened activity. And those expressions of enlightened activity can sort of appear as goddesses in visions, with which male and female yogis and yoginis might be engaging as part of their religious. The great female Buddhas like Vajra Yogini, Vajra Varahi are dakinis, are yoginis, as yidams. And then there are also human embodied dakinis. So like I said, dakini or khandro then becomes a term in Tibetan Himalayan societies to describe a kind of female religious specialist who may do a range of things. They may be recognized for having very powerful natural powers of clairvoyance. They may perform healings or divinations. They may have become sort of mediums for goddesses, worldly protector deities or something like that, who themselves are a kind of khandra. And so there's a sort of conflation of levels, and in the context of sexual yoga practice, both the yogi and yogini are not conceiving of themselves as ordinary samsaric human beings with ordinary samsaric human bodies. When they engage in those meditative practices that incorporate sexuality, sort of a required part of those practices is to conceive of yourself and your partner as being a Buddha, a Daka or Dakini. And so these labels are operating on many levels. And then also in terms of kind of standard root vows of Vajrayana, we are told that initiates of Vajrayana should never impugn women, even in jest. They should never speak ill of women or think ill of them or behave abusively to them, because all women, whether they're practicing Buddhism or not, are in their essential nature dakinis. So there's many levels on which this is working. But in a sort of ethnographic sense, in terms of what do these, in a way that an anthropologist might be interested in, how are people using these labels in an everyday way? I would say that ngakpa is not commonly found. I mean, I've searched through online databases of text to see if it comes up, and it essentially never comes up before the last 20 years. But because the role that ngakpa are playing within their societies is such a fundamentally normatively masculine one. However, any ngakma there might be would also sort of fall into the broader, more nebulous category of dakini or khandroma. So I think there are overlaps with the way that the term dakini and daka are being used by some neo-tantric practitioners, and then how they're used in a more traditional Vajrayana sense. But one thing I've noticed in that sort of context, in the New Age neo-tantric context, is that often people will begin calling themselves a daka or dakini once they've sort of committed to certain neo-tantric practices, or even in a more formal way, once they've sort of once they've done enough, once they're affiliated with certain teachers, or they've completed certain training courses. It differs. Maybe someone will just append that to themselves because they're using it as a way to kind of remind themselves of their innate divinity. I think a lot of different things. There's a lot of different stuff going on. In the Tibetan context, women will often be recognized as being dakinis in some or other fashion by religious authorities. And because men dominate in the religious world, that's often by the men. So in the same way that a tuku, a reincarnate lama, will be recognized as a result of certain signs or capacities that they exhibit in childhood or later on in life, there are occasions where lamas will say, this woman is a dakini of such and such a type. And so the way that Vajrayana categorizes kinds of dakinis is some dakinis are kind of are born. Some dakinis are dakinis by virtue of dedicated tantric yogic practice. I will say, though, because this is usually a kind of point of contention and confusion, I personally have not really come across any Tibetan text on heterosexual sexual yoga practice, which hasn't made it pretty explicit that the ideal partner for practice, these texts are written from very male-centric perspective, sort of catering from the point of view of men's bodies, men's interests, priorities, issues, and so on. But I haven't come across a single text that I've looked at here which is sort of not stressed that the ideal partner for a yogi for these sorts of practices should be a yogini who is also initiated into Tantra, also understands and respects the teachings, has also ideally done the same, if not higher levels of practices as the male practitioner. So you can see I'm going around all over the place now, but there's different ways in which these terms get used, and there's often a sort of an overlapping or sort of conflation between, I guess, non-human levels of significance of this term, and then the human practitioners who bear these terms. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Have you thought much about the purpose of that vow, never to disparage women even in jest? Pure vision is a sort of a part of the deal with highest yoga tantra, tantric practice in general. It would seem, therefore, redundant to make an additional exhortation in that direction, unless it was perhaps counteracting a prevalent cultural trend to the contrary, or perhaps there's some other purpose for that. What would you say is the purpose there?
Yeah, one explanation that I have heard is indeed what you just said. That, you know, some scholars have said, does this really indicate a kind of tantric feminism, or does it indicate instead just the reality that misogyny and the sort of inferior status of women was so ordinary in other contexts that it had to be stressed here, and that maybe some people have even gone so far as to say maybe that positioning of woman in the context of tantric peer review is itself a kind of transgressive. It's yet another expression of tantric transgression, given kind of mainstream Indian conventions around gender. I mean, I think there's something to that for sure. We need to look at these things in their particular historical, political context too. I know Dr. Nida has said too that he believes that this overemphasis in the textual corpus and in the tradition on men's bodies and men's practice, and which, you know, you could be forgiven for thinking that, and some scholars have said this, that sexual yoga practices in Vajrayana are really nothing more than a kind of spiritual justification for men getting to have sex with women, or more charitably, for men to actualize their spiritual needs. And women's spiritual powers or needs are effectively irrelevant. They're simply tools to be exploited by men in a patriarchal society. And again, there's something to that. But Nida says, for example, he says, you know, I think all these texts were written by men about how to cultivate sexuality, because they tend to be worse at it. They tend to have less of a kind of they're coming from a gendered norms that make it harder for them to engage in these practices. They need more help, and they need to kind of rework their conditioning a lot more. So there's that point to be made too. I can't answer your question. I don't know the exact history of how these things emerge. Better scholars than me have written about the development of goddess cults, the development of the cult of the Dakinis. In the Shaiva context, scholars like David Gordon White, Shaman Hatley, you know, this kind of cult of the Dakini yogini emerges out of ascetic charnel ground practices in India, kind of pre-tantric into tantric practices where people are going into these wild, contaminating, haunted environments like the charnel ground, and willingly calling up these kind of flesh-eating dakinis I mentioned, offering their body fluids. This is men, typically men, but in the way that we get it as a textual tradition, once again, it's men offering their sort of vital fluids and flesh to willingly be consumed by flying female demonesses, who then in exchange grant siddhi. This then sort of is a kind of apotheosis where practitioners become Bhairava, and they're sort of taken up by hordes of Dakinis and sort of deified, but unite with Shiva, with God. And this is complicated terrain. It develops in many different directions, and we see the imprint of it in various forms. A lot of these practices look quite similar to Chit practice in the Tibetan context too. And so, we know that those kinds of spirits became associated with certain kinds of women who were part of these communities in various sorts of ways. And then this evolves into kind of more codified sexual yoga practice as well. And we have this movement from sort of Indian practices involving engagement with impure substances and consumption of impure substances, sexual fluids, and contaminating sort of the sex and death imagery that's so familiar from the highest yoga tantras. And then we see as time goes on in Tibet, sexual yoga sexual meditations become much more about working with the subtle body and the experience of sexual bliss as a basis for meditation, as just one other thing on which one can use and on which one can meditate in order to experience the clear-eyed nature of mind. So already we see a kind of shift. There's these different layers of practice. In Tibet we never see those kinds of relationships with like celestials, slightly scary, but also blessing granting, ferocious female divinities. That never goes away, even as the technologies of sexual yoga transform, or the emphasis of why are you offering sexual fluids, or what the offering means, or how that fits into non-dual tantric philosophies. There's many different levels at which sex stuff is going on in Indo-Tibetan tantric traditions. And in Tibet, we see all of these levels kind of happening at once as part of different practices, different levels of different practices. So I think it's a bit of a bewildering terrain. But yeah, I don't know the exact answer to your question about how that emerges. But I will say, as my closing thought on this, that many scholars of religion have pointed out that just because you have a goddess-oriented religion, just because you have representations of female power, just because you have a spiritual tradition which actually prioritizes the feminine over and above the masculine, or it doesn't necessarily mean that that translates into the kind of facts of social arrangements, right? Goddess traditions can flourish in thoroughly everyday patriarchal environments, right? And so this has been a question that's sort of exercised and been of great interest to scholars and practitioners for a long time. That point of translation or lack thereof. How is it that we can have a tradition that's so goddess-centric and yet still see so much marginalization of actual female-bodied practitioners, or of queer practitioners, non-heteronormative, normatively masculine practitioners, and so on. So I think even well beyond tantric traditions, just sort of across the world's religions, this is a really interesting question. And there's a lot that could be said on that too, yeah. But I'll leave it.
Yeah, I'd actually like to ask you a bit about that a bit later, about how sexual expressions outside of the heteronormative one are treated and addressed. But before we go there, you've been talking quite a bit about this idea of sangyum, consorts. And you write here, Tibetan tantric Buddhist sexual yoga practices have often been generalized or caricatured by non-Tibetan commentators as inherently and inevitably oriented towards male bodies, needs and priorities, as being fundamentally about exploiting sangyum as nothing but disposable tools for men's spiritual advancement. Blanket characterizations of tantric sexual yoga as inherently disempowering for women have been roundly challenged by recent scholarship, and you give several references. Still, it remains nonetheless true that female practitioners have indeed been exploited and abused by male practitioners under the guise of tantric sex, and that Tibetan women have found it difficult to operate as religious authorities without some sort of relationship or ratification by powerful men. And you say that the status and uses of non-celibate sexuality in Tibetan tantric Buddhist contexts continues to be contentious. And I think you've made several of those points. Can you give a sense, specifically in the area of sangyum and tantric sex partner, can you give a sense of the range of religious and cultural factors at play here?
Well, I have a couple of things I can say around that. I think when we're looking at Indian precedents and Indian texts, we're really dealing with a kind of a different sort of social cultural environment. That's an important thing to remember. You may have had groups of initiates meeting under cover of darkness to be part of a religious community that was transgressive just because it contained people from many castes who, outside of the initiatic secret context, weren't even supposed to be talking to one another, let alone having sex with one another. So potentially. So I think that when you're looking at some of the Indian material, female consorts for male practitioners are kind of, they're sometimes referred to in authoritative text by terms that sort of indicate their low status, like washerwoman or things like that. And it's part of this kind of transgressive, non-dual environment in which these practices are occurring. But then, of course, when these things come to Tibet, when yogini tantras or highest yoga tantras come to Tibet, and they're referencing the incorporation of sexuality on the spiritual path, they're coming to a place where the cultural, social norms are different. Tibetan forms of marriage, just outside of Vajrayana, just ordinary cultural marriage patterns are just so wildly diverse and flexible and different to anything that you could imagine ever seeing in Hindu India. So it's always interesting to me how people kind of want to just speak about what the tradition says about gender, or what the tradition says about the possibility of enlightenment in a female body and so on. But there's been much less discussion about the fact that, okay, well, Tibet incorporated these teachings and developed them as a particular society, as particular kinds of people with their own sort of cultural norms and expectations. So it's much, as we mentioned before, right from the beginning when Buddhism comes into Tibet, you have a community of non-celibate, non-monastic vow holders, and then a community of monastic celibate ones. And so the idea of having a kind of, it's a bit funny when you use this term, sangyum, secret mother, this honorific term, because in practice, the sangyum of several great lamas are not necessarily secret. They're publicly recognized as the wife of this practitioner. We often see this pattern that Holly Gailey has spoken about too. It's difficult for sangyum to operate as religious teachers in their own right, especially when their husbands are still alive. But because, as you mentioned, there is this pattern occasionally where older lamas who may have been living celibate lives, or maybe they weren't already, but who might have health problems or various obstacles, and this is where it's a bit hard for kind of people less familiar with the sort of cosmology involved and the technicalities involved in all this to understand. But the practice of sexual yoga is often associated with of removing obstacles and subduing sort of demonic influences and forces. So we have instances of great treasure revealers being led by prophecy to engage in karma mudra, in sexual yoga practice with a physical partner, in order to protect Tibet from foreign invasion, or to dispel various other kinds of obstacles. So for some people, it's just sort of, when we see Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava do this also. He's using sexual yoga to attain immortality, but also to subdue adverse forces and to allow for the flourishing of Buddha Dharma in Tibet. So this can be a little bit hard for someone not sort of au fait with tantric yogic worldviews to understand how two individuals and the goings on in their apparently individual subtle bodies could have some sort of impact like that. And yeah, it's definitely true that there's this pattern. So because older lamas who are already ailing may enter into partnerships with younger women, this certainly doesn't help the stereotype that certain sexual yoga practices are about men literally vampirizing women's vital force. And it is true that karma mudra practices can be used to improve one's health. That's a sort of incidental, temporary benefit beyond the ultimate benefit of enlightenment. Sarah Jacobi, another Tibetan studies scholar, has written in a very interesting way about this dynamic, because she actually shows she explores in wonderful detail the autobiographical writings of she never calls herself a ngakma, incidentally. She says she's not a nun and she's not an ordinary lay woman. Her name's Sarah Khandroma. She was a great female treasurer healer who I think has come up on this show before. And she mentions how, there were times when male practitioners were kind of seeking her out so that she could teach them sexual yoga practices, and so that she could help them improve their health thereby. But it's interesting in that she, as an older woman, I think she has arthritis, if I remember correctly, in her leg or something. She seeks out a younger male consort who is karmically destined who energetically who's appropriate for her to practice with. She's already experienced in sexual yoga practice. She's been practicing alone and with her guru/partner. And various other men, and she talks quite matter-of-factly about how she found a male partner who she could practice with in order to cure her physical ailments. So we might not see parity or equivalence in the written record because of how it's skewed by just the structural facts of a particular society, which are not negligible. I have one instance that I mentioned in the dissertation where the daughter of a ngakpa that I met tells me about how her mother had initially been very excited to have the opportunities and prestige that would come with being the wife of a great lama. But then, to her dismay, discovers that there's a lot of kind of baggage that comes along with raising children. She thought that closeness to a lama would provide her opportunities for religious practice. She'd been practicing in a very dedicated way as a single woman. And then she got embroiled and tied up in all these kinds of familial duties and lama politics. And so I mentioned how this acquaintance of mine had said, that her mother actually said, don't become a khandroma like I did. Don't marry a lama. If you really want to practice, be a nun. Keep yourself somewhat separate from men. But then, of course, nuns have their own obstacles, right? The expectations that they should remain attached to their family and continue to support their family even after ordaining are very different compared to monks in Tibet and the Himalayas. So I guess, this is something Nida and I have spoken about a lot. Like, the tradition certainly looks a certain way. It's certainly been dominated by male voices and interests. But it doesn't have to be like that, especially when the social conditions in which people are living now might be quite different. In terms of its technology, there is really no reason why all sexual yoga practices, broadly speaking, some require partners and are quite heteronormative, but most sexual yoga practices, that what they are based on in terms of their technologies, uh, can be practiced by anyone with a human body and a human mind, and who understands the teachings and doesn't have obstacles to applying them. They can do so with their own body. This is something that isn't always immediately clear to some people, but tummo yoga, inner heat yoga, tummo yoga is sexual yoga. It's sexual yoga with your own body. Um, and then once you've mastered that, the traditional approach was to then practice with another's body. These are the terms in Tibetan. Tummo is referred to as ranglu tapten, and then shenlu tapten. The method with one's own body, and then the method with another's. Sexual yoga with a physical partner is the method with another's. It's like tummo for two. It's not only that, but yeah. And then one last thing I'll say is what's interesting about I was talking about how, Tibetan society is different to Indian society. It has different social structures and cultural norms, which are obviously going to affect how sexual yoga is understood and practiced. One way in which that's true is the Dharma tradition writ large. Sexual yoga becomes so. It's not just that sexual yoga practices become central to Vajrayana in India as part of initiation initially, but it's also that in Tibet the Dharma tradition becomes so important and powerful as a kind of social cultural force, religious force. And by and large, sexual yoga is kind of synonymous with the production, with the unveiling of Dharma. It's, there are a couple of very prominent Tertama who remained celibate, who did not have karma mudra partners, but they're in the extreme minority, and often in their life stories, there's elaborate accounts about why it is that they opted not to have sexual yoga partners, or they practice only with some and not others, and so there's this idea in the treasure tradition that every prophesized treasure revealer has an allotted karmic partner, someone who really karmically is meant for them in terms of doing this practice. Energetically, their channels align. They activate one another. They come together as a kind of destined alignment. They're literally acting out a kind of karmic choreography, which incidentally is another reason why one can maybe raise one's eyebrow a little bit at when you hear stories about lamas who seem to just be chewing up and spitting out, casual sex partner after casual sex partner. This is not what we really see in the kind of soaring narratives of reunion across past lives and karmic and energetic alignment. That's kind of a part of the deal of being a treasure revealer who, through partnered sexual meditation, is able to enter into the extremely rarefied states of consciousness, of non-dual, non-conceptual awareness, of beyond time and space, that allows them to then extract these treasures that were hidden there by the original couple, Padmasambhava and Nishitsogya. And so in that way, treasure revealers are kind of living the mythic history of the original tantric couple in Tibet, the original karmically destined partners. And yeah, there are definitely different models, as you say. Sometimes sangyum are quite secret; they aren't publicly known, and then this causes all kinds of problems, especially if the practitioner is a monk publicly. And so yeah, there's a lot that could be said about this term, and how maybe dakini and sangyum could be used to to aggrandize individuals. Certainly, ordinary Tibetans I know. Sorry, I can say it's the term ordinary. No one's ordinary. Let's say not lamas. But just, Tibetan friends of mine will often say, okay, well, this yogini, this Tibetan or non-Tibetan practitioner of tantric yoga, whoever it might be, is using this term dakini or khandroma to describe himself. The first thing people are going to say is like, who authorized that? On whose authority? I talk briefly in the dissertation about how one friend of mine too is like very Tibetan friend of mine, very blasé about it. He's like, oh yeah, if a lama really wants to, he can get the private office of His Holiness Dalai Lama to recognize his girlfriend as a khandroma, and give a stamp of legitimacy. So you could say maybe a measure of jadedness or cynicism around this too within Tibetan communities. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but certainly there's many ways in which to look at this term. This term is both a blessing or an actualization of one's purpose, and then also potentially as a curse, like my friend's mother said. Avoid this label, avoid this status, if you really want to practice. So.
That's fascinating. And later in your dissertation, you go into great detail about the retreats that one would undergo in the realm of Kama Mudra and so on. It's really fascinating. And I want to sort of wait for the sort of practical technology discussion when we reach that part of the dissertation, and perhaps then also draw on your work with Dr Nida Chenagtsang, your Kama Mudra book, which also lays out a great deal of the technology or techniques. There we go. I'll cut that in. Yeah, and which is a fabulous book. So I'd like two more really areas here just to get your take on. So we're looking really here at the social setting of Karma Mudra, and we'll deal later with in a later episode, as we get to that point in your dissertation, with the technology of it and how it's said to be done and how it's really done, and it's a very fascinating area. One thing that comes to mind as you're riffing on these topics, a cultural trend, or part of the culture, I think, in America and perhaps Europe, is this idea of, and we see it expressed in codes of ethics for doctors, for lawyers, for therapists, this idea of a power differential being an immoral, not illegal, but an immoral component of a sexual union. In other words, if a therapist is not allowed to have, by their code of ethics, is not allowed to have sex with their client, even if the client wants to. A doctor is not supposed to have sex with the patient, even if the patient wants to, and is sort of legally consenting. So I wonder how you see in the translation of Vajrayana in the sort of Western context or American European context, given that in the tradition we're discussing, sex across a power differential such as guru-disciple is a legitimate, has a legitimate place, can be abused, yes, but also has a sort of non-abusive version. And given that in our culture it seems the trend is towards any sex across a power differential being at the very least suspect, if not verboten, basically. As these two cultural perspectives come together, with Vajrayana in America and in Europe and so on, and I'm wondering if you'd thought about a way through that.
I think so. I think I have. I guess obviously cultural, historical norms and are going to come in here. Like I sort of mentioned earlier, Tibetan sexual conventions differ across the Tibetan plateau. In exile, outside of exile, just this is, I'm not talking about spiritual traditions or anything like that, just everyday sexual conventions and ideas about marriage and romance and relationships. I talk in the dissertation about how family structures and patterns of marriage have transformed dramatically in the last 50 years of Tibetan exile. Tibetans are having so many fewer kids than they had in the past in exile. They're getting married so much later. They're using contraception at an incredibly high rate. These are all sort of everyday facts about how, we can never think of sexuality in it, or sexual practice, no matter how lofty or esoteric seeming, in a kind of in a vacuum. A lot of what I was trying to do in the dissertation was to sketch out a kind of broader domain of lay sexual conventions, to then understand how esoteric knowledge operates, traditional esoteric knowledge operates within that broader context. So yeah, I mean, inherently in Vajrayana, the guru and the disciple are not equal. They can never be equal until the moment of their unification. So let me explain that. The whole point of having a teacher or a mentor or a guide is that they know more and better than you. They can guide you. Otherwise, they would not be your teacher. If you think you know more than the guru, then they shouldn't be your guru, and you shouldn't be their student. You should at least ask yourself why you're claiming to have entered into this, teacher disciple relationship when you don't want it to be like that. So I mean, yeah, inherently your guru is supposed to be someone who is not equal to you in terms of expertise or experience or authority, right? And then, of course, when you do guru yoga meditation, the whole point of that meditation is to realize the utter equivalence of the ultimate nature of your own mind and the ultimate nature of the guru's mind. That's why you have this relationship, this unequal relationship, so that it can actualize the kind of meditative experience of equality. So that's a whole other issue about what guru yoga is. But yeah, I mean, there are many accounts of people who, and these sorts of sexual scandals, tantric casualties have been coming up more and more recently. There are many accounts of students who have engaged in sexual relationships with their gurus, which is not historically unfounded or unfamiliar, right? Who have subsequently said that they felt that relationship was abusive, exploitative, that it deeply harmed them, that they were being gaslit and controlled by the teachers for the teacher's own gain. So when Dr. Nida and I put together this book, his primary motivation, he says in the acknowledgement, the dedication at the beginning, he says he'd like to dedicate the book to all victims of sexual abuse, and especially to those who've been abused in the name of spiritual and religious traditions. May the pain and suffering caused by sexual abuse swiftly cease in every corner of this earth. So where that comes from is that Dr. Nida, as a physician, had been seeing many female patients around the world, in Asian contexts and elsewhere, who were confessing to him that this had happened, and he could see physical and psychological harm that had been done to them as part of these sexual relationships. And as a ngakpa himself, trained in sexual yoga practices, who is married, who has kids, and believes that these practices have benefit for any number of practitioners, male, female, practitioners who are LGBTQ+, he really wanted to put this book out in large part because he was saying, I recognize that this has been a part of this field in which this knowledge circulates, in which these relationships happen. And it's not a case of saying there's never going to be an instance where there can't be a necessary or enlightening relationship between guru and disciple that is sexual. I mean, we simply can't say it because, as I mentioned, Yeshe Tsogyal was the disciple of Guru Rinpoche, and she's the first Tibetan who became enlightened through Vajrayana practice, through that relationship. So, we can't say that this is not a thing. But in terms of our book, Nida was trying to say, look, students need to understand what these practices involve. You're always going to have a kind of innately sort of open to abuse, open to exploitation situation where students are engaged with gurus and with tantric practices and tantric sangha, where they don't even know what sexual yoga really is, what it's been historically, what it involves, as you said, the nuts and bolts, and the kind of context in which it's flourished, and the way it's been explained by the tradition. Like what we see a lot of the time is sexual yoga practices are so, historically they've been considered very advanced practices, apex practices, and extraordinarily secret. I mean, one of the euphemisms for a partnered sexual yoga practice is sangyum, the secret conduct. It's that secret stuff. So I think that creates an environment where people feel like, well, that's above my security clearance, or it's inappropriate for me to ask questions or say, like, what is this really about, or how does this work, or because you're just a humble student and certainly not at that level. And so then if a situation happens where a teacher comes and says, oh, like I've chosen you to assist me in this great spiritual work, etc., etc., that student is from the get-go disempowered because they didn't have a means to ask about this. They weren't furnished with a kind of broad education around the lay of the land with these practices. And then they also feel that they can't refuse or speak back to their guru because of that relationship in which they've entered. So I think for Nida, at any rate, and for us working on our book, our feeling was really like it would be better if there were opportunities for practitioners to educate themselves before they get involved in these kinds of relationships. And I can't say categorically that one instance of abuse was, I mean, I have my personal opinions, but I can't categorically pronounce as an all-knowing Buddha that one instance of a sexual relationship between a guru and disciple was wholly and solely motivated by self-serving samsaric interests. I think that in some cases, it's, my opinion is that in some cases, you hear from disciples who've been involved in those relationships that they were being told by the guru that what they were doing was sexual yoga. But then when you hear some details about it, it doesn't resemble anything like sexual meditation sadhana. It's sort of the behavior of the teacher, the sort of pattern of relationships that they have with partners doesn't look like what we see in some other instances of sexual yoga practice. But I'm not going to make pronouncements authoritatively. And I should just expand on what we were kind of doing in the book. We weren't saying, okay, here's the book that will provide a kind of, what are those travel guide books called? Lonely Planet. Like, it's not a Lonely Planet. Read it before you jump into a unequal relationship of sexual tutelage under guru. That was definitely not what this book was about. This book was about explaining what the kind of historical, cultural context and logic and technologies of these practices have involved, so that individual practitioners could decide for themselves whether they thought that these practices could benefit them on their spiritual path, and stressing that female practitioners or LGBTQ practitioners don't require if you have received transmissions for the teachings, you understand what they involve, and you're in a good position to practice them. You can practice with your own body. You can practice with an imagined partner. You can practice with a co-initiate or a husband or wife. I just want to point that out because I don't want to give listeners the impression that this sort of paradigmatic model of sexual yoga practice is a guru who initiates you with his penis. Now, there may have been a period in history, as we touched on briefly before, where the rites of initiation into highest yoga tantra did involve some of those elements, and it could also be a female guru initiating a male student as well. But this is only one domain historically in which these things appear, and as we mentioned before, they're no longer how initiation is transmitted. It's no longer the standard fashion in which highest yoga tantra initiation happens in Tibetan Buddhist context. So, in terms of your question, yeah, I mean, I've sort of semi-jokingly said that my greatest hope for this book is that someone with a fascination in tantric sex might read it and go, oh, yeah, I don't think that's the practice for me. I don't think that's like, I don't think I need to work with my sexuality in that way. I don't think that's the practice that clicks for me or that will be efficacious for me. Now that I understand it, I see that maybe dream yoga or chud or guru yoga practices or any other number of the vast array of tantric yogic disciplines might be the one that is really a profoundly transformative practice for me. So I think that your question is a huge question, though, in terms of how much room is there for a total reorganization of the kind of cultural and social power structures that have been a part of these traditions. It's a similar question to His Holiness the Dalai Lama increasing, over the last few years, more and more kind of bluntly announcing that he thinks that it's time for a serious rethink and overhaul of the entire Tuku institution, the institution of succession via reincarnation, the vesting of power and authority in for the most part, male reincarnated lamas in this way. So yeah, I mean, this is a question that everyone is answering differently right now. To what extent do we try to, if Vajrayana emerged out of certain social and political context, to what extent, what's essential and what's disposable? And people have very different, modernists and traditionalists, these very strong and fraught lines that are being drawn right now. Sometimes the traditionalists are accused of being modernists, and the modernists are accused of being traditionalists. There's no one simple answer. I think, part of what this book was Nida acknowledging, things that hadn't been acknowledged traditionally. I've come across no Tibetan text describing sexual yoga which acknowledges that, transgender practitioners might practice, apart from one or two hints in the Yuthuk Nyingtik. But Dr. Nida, directly addresses this and explains why it's entirely possible, in his opinion, for transgender and homosexual practitioners, queer practitioners of various kinds, to still use these practices for their intended purposes, and to even repurpose some of the technical features of them to their own needs. Now, I guess that's what happens when any form of religious change takes place, right? We have practitioners in a particular historical context appealing to authoritative texts, histories, and institutions and figures, and then trying to see the extent to which that aligns and what they're willing to like the Dalai Lama is willing to say, well, look, is the Tuku tradition Buddhist or is it Tibetan? And so then, depending on our answer, what do we make of that? And so, absolutely, we're seeing this happen in so many small and big ways in sanghas all around the world, right? One model, as you mentioned, is the Aroter, who emphasize a kind of formalized domestic partnership as the sort of standard model for how their sangha operates and how their teachings are transmitted and practiced. That sort of couples, I know that there are queer members, but it seems like a fairly heteronormative model of, married partners or monogamous partners. And so, yeah, I mean, these challenges are going to affect sanghas all over the world. They're affecting Tibetan communities as well in their own unique ways too, about how to rethink power and authority and its distribution. I know that some communities I know of have gone so far as to say, can we imagine tantric practice, legitimate tantric practice, without the, can we rethink the entire guru idea? That's interesting to me as an anthropologist. I don't really understand that personally, because like based on my understanding of how the mechanisms of guru yoga, I don't really know how that works personally, but that's certainly been, conversations are going in that direction. Perhaps we need to rethink the guru entirely. That seems like a total impossibility to a lot of like Tibetan Buddhists. The guru is the kind of the linchpin of the system in a way. I think what we see more often is people sort of saying like, perhaps the way that you're understanding what the relationship of the guru really is about needs to change or be reconsidered. And so sex and sexual interactions are one part of that. But certainly, we did not write this book with the intention of sort of exonerating guru-disciple sexual relations, after providing a more thorough education of how that works. It was more about saying, here's how sexual yoga has often existed within Tibetan context. Here are some of the controversies and concerns and misunderstandings about its purpose, its form, why it's done. And here are some suggestions about how people could maybe do it by themselves on a level that's appropriate to their training. That's a whole other issue that we could get into in a more detailed discussion about the kind of technologies behind this. But, and yeah, also just, as I said, for informative purposes, if someone reads this book, it's certainly not necessarily an encouragement to practice sexual yoga, or kind of suggesting that it needs to be done if they want to practice Buddhism. So, yeah, I mean, these things are definitely still unfolding, these questions. And I'm interested as an anthropologist in the different ways that different communities are responding to this. I don't feel capable of giving some personal pronouncement about what I think is the best way to avoid abuses of power. They certainly happen, and they happen regularly enough. So there's a need to have these conversations. And there are conversations that are being had all over the world. It's like often traditionalist non-Tibetan convert Buddhists will say, this is Western liberalism. This is just a kind of alien ideology that's being opposed to a completely different system of thinking and being, to Tantra, non-dual Tantra. And again, there's something to that. Are we trying to understand one system? So this is the sin of ethnocentrism, right, in anthropology. Never tried to understand how one system of practice or belief works in terms of another system of practice, values, or belief, right? But, Tibetans who are born and raised in this cultural world are also asking questions. They're also responding to controversy in a variety of ways. And I think it would be a little bit shallow to say that the Tibetans who have critiques or issues of these practices and their potential for abuse have just sort of drunk in some kind of Western democratic, liberal, individualist Kool-Aid. Because it's just not true. I mean, I mentioned in the dissertation, I don't know if you saw that part, I made a point of including a critique, a gentle jokey critique that Jumipam, the great Nyingma non-sectarian master, makes of practitioners of Karma Mudra in the Nyingma school, with which he himself was associated. This is a 19th century critique by somebody who wrote about the practice of Karma Mudra and how important and legitimate it was. He makes this kind of little joke where he says, "Oh, it's so interesting how it kind of ties into what we've been talking about." Let me see if I can just find it here. I have this short section in the dissertation where I look at authoritative all-male figures from the Vajrayana tradition, sort of speaking back to Karma Mudra practice, and it's those who have emphasized it as a necessity, or emphasized it in certain ways that these masters feel is problematic. So should I read this?
Yeah.
He says, so this is from a little sort of fun little text he wrote where he starts by making fun of all the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism, sort of stereotyping and satirizing them and their tendencies. And then he finishes by applauding their stereotypical capacities and tendencies, and then saying, like, let's all get along. All schools are great and all schools are equal. So this is his sort of lampooning of Nyingma practitioners. And, Ngakpa has been most prevalent in the Nyingma school, which sort of develops institutionalized monasticism at a slightly later moment than some of the other schools, or at least emphasizes it. So he says, Nyingma lamas, while they accept that there is a path of clear light, great perfection, or dzogchen, so Ati Yoga, the highest vehicle of the 9 vehicles of the Nyingma, in which one may attain the level of Vajradhara Buddha, full enlightenment, without relying on things like an external Karma Mudra or tantric sex partner. So they acknowledge that, he says. They have these alternative methods for Buddhahood that don't require the use of the physical sexual partner. He says, nonetheless, these lamas, they say that lamas should make use of women to increase their lifespans, to improve their eyesight, be free of sickness, and to reveal beneficial treasure teachings for the sake of sentient beings. So they say all these things that lamas should use sexual yoga partners. And then he says, yet they don't say that those lamas need to teach and practice for the sake of the teachings themselves. Because these are all quite sort of instrumentalizations of sexual yoga, right? Like, I'll improve my eyesight. These are sort of, he says, so they don't say they need to teach and practice for the sake of the teachings themselves. It seems really funny, really amazing, really incredible to me that partnered tantric sexual yoga could fulfill the function of benefiting the teachings and sentient beings, of furthering both instruction and practice of the teachings, and of improving one's eyesight all at the same time. How wonderful. So, in a gentle way, he's saying, I'm not sure I believe all you non-celibate lamas when you're saying it's so necessary for you to do these practices. How, it seems a little self-serving to me. But at the same time, it's important to understand that this is someone from inside the tradition. This is someone who himself wrote texts on how to do sexual yoga practices for his students. I think that for me, it's just we have to recognize that criticism is necessary and real and complex, and it's coming from all kinds of different places, and it's not some new interloper. I'm sympathetic to this complaint that we should be cautious about applying different frameworks, alien, foreign frameworks to understanding practices that take place in a wholly different cultural and historical context. But we are all people who live in the world. Tibetans don't live in a Tibetan medieval feudal society or a Tibetan medieval feudal mindset. And then by virtue of that are somehow not participants in the modern world, capable of holding more than one way of thinking and being in their minds simultaneously. I think we can get really essentializing in how we trace out the kind of the boundaries in these kinds of discussions and debates. I try to just to look at it more as an anthropologist might. I mean, of course, I have my own feelings about what might constitute abuse, but I'm interested in this kind of critical tradition because we see it, as I mentioned in the dissertation. We see even Saraha, pretty old Mahasiddha commentator, making fun of people who overemphasize sexual yoga practice. So, I think the cultural politics involved in this are very complicated.
Complicated indeed. I'm curious as we round off this episode. You mentioned, of course, that certainly the texts are very often written from a heteronormative perspective, and that the idea of a ngakpa is often a gendered role, if you like, with a certain orientation, sexual orientation implied, it seems. How is non-heteronormative expressions of sexuality, or how does that appear, I suppose, both traditionally but also societally? You're there, of course, on the ground with your field work. And what did you observe along those lines?
So I myself am queer, and it was interesting doing a lot of this research because, as I mentioned, so many of the texts and even the encounters that I was having were very heteronormative. I won't get into the whole dynamic of what it's like being someone who's coded as queer in their everyday life in, say, South Africa or America. Has sort of gotten used to, over the years, people gendering you and sort of identifying your sexual orientation before you even open your mouth, and then to move somewhere else in the world where the rules are slightly different and only some people read you the same way. And that's really, it's a great lesson in the nature of the constructed nature of identity, the contingent nature of identity. That was an interesting experience for me, just in general, doing field work that I would have had whether or not I was doing a lot of research into sexual practices of various kinds. Yes, the texts Tibetan sexual yoga texts are really quite heteronormative and heterosexual in flavor, seemingly even more so than some Indian texts, because in some of the Shaiva texts, you see at least this kind of stock acknowledgement of third gender. Even in the Indian Kama Shastra text, which are not tantric, but actually have a whole chapter in the dissertation about how Kama Shastra, Kama Sutra, actually becomes tantric in Tibet, more tantric because it becomes incorporated into sort of the curriculum of sexual yoga. That's a whole other issue. But in Tibetan texts, you see even less direct discussion of queerness of various kinds than you do in some of the Indian material. Now, one of the unique things about this book, the Karma Mudra book, is that I'm openly queer, and Nida has known that about me since we've met, and so it was really nice to have a discussion with a straight lama with very little exposure to queer lifestyles, but several queer students, and to ask him candid questions, and for him to ask me candid questions too. It has been a very nice exchange. So there's so much more we could have said. We had a section in the book where we talk about this, and I've experienced this and seen people, queer practitioners or would-be practitioners, experience this where whether it be New Age Tantra, Neo Tantra, or Vajrayana, they're seeing very heteronormative imagery. There's a Yap and there's a Yum, there's a male Buddha and a female Buddha, and when it comes to actual sexual yoga practices, it's kind of assumed that there's a female-bodied practitioner and a male-bodied practitioner, and the male-bodied practitioner is self-generating, is arising as a male Buddha, and the yogini is arising as a female one. And these practices typically involve a preliminary step where the genitals are consecrated Um, the penis is sort of arises or is visualized as a vajra, and with mantric syllables on it, the vagina vulva as a lotus. This is part of the sacralization, the sort of maintaining of the idea that this is not ordinary sex, right? So in my experience, I had a lot of experience in studying and interacting with people before getting involved in tantric Buddhism, in sort of Western sex magic and neo-tantra and that sort of thing. My experience in those communities is that what ends up happening is that sort of what I would consider entirely historically specific, like kind of parochial, provincial, historically, culturally provincial ideas about gender roles. In those communities, they frequently get kind of deified. So in New Age tantric context, it's not uncommon to hear that the feminine, the sacred feminine is like this, or woman's energy is like this, or there's masculine energy and female energy, and there's a kind of essentializing and almost cosmologizing of what I consider to be cultural stuff. But that almost become described as if they're innate. Like Phil Hine, a friend of mine who's sort of got one foot in Western occultism and Tantra, he's written some great stuff about how in neo-tantric and Western occult communities since the sort of 50s to the present, people are a bit more wise to it now, and it's gotten a little better. People are a bit more conscious and aware. But there used to be Wiccan groups who also practice a hieros gamos, right, a sacred rite, where the high priest and the high priestess call down the god and the goddess, and then they engage in public sex, and then there's a sacrament and so on. And there used to be groups that would deny entry to trance and queer people. It seems unthinkable now because being a witch is so associated with queerness, it seems, these days. But it used to be that people would say, oh, your channels are broken, or they pathologized deviant sexuality in the language of these of spirituality and spiritual traditions and the subtle body. Oh, your chakras are upside down, or you have too much yin energy and that's why you're a bottom. And so, all these kinds of things. And it's interesting because when you really look, and my colleague Christopher Wallace has discussed this too in the Shaiva context, when you look at Indo-Tibetan sexual yoga texts, you don't see anything like this. You don't see an explicit philosophy that cosmologizes conventional ideas of gender. The whole point is that these are symbolic conventions which are arbitrary and get dissolved through the practice. The whole point is that you realize that there is nothing intrinsically feminine or masculine. These are dualistic conceptions that, like a lot of the sexual yoga texts, the Tibetan sexual yoga texts say that one of the requirements of a practitioner is that they must have no shame about any sexual acts that they may engage in the context of sexual meditation. Because any shame that you might feel about this act being dirty or weird, or you saying this word, or feeling this way, or wanting to touch or be touched that way, that's human contrivance. That's something that's a kind of dualistic conceptuality that the practice is actually dissolving. So it's always been strange to me that then you see kind of new age versions of sacred sexuality, which seem like they're not only fixated on those dualistic conceptions, they've actually kind of elevated them to the level of theology. So even though there are these conventions in the sexual yoga text, the male imagines himself as the male Buddha, and the yab and then the yum, and then the penis is the dorje and it goes inside the lotus. We mustn't get confused about what these things are. So that's why it was really nice to talk to Nida about this, and he just very explicitly explained, look, sexual yoga practice in Tibetan context is about using whatever means work to experience sensory desire, the inflaming of the senses, arousal, sexual bliss. It becomes the material for your meditation. Just like with chit, your feelings of selflessness and fear and generosity are focused. Just like with dream yoga, your dualistic conceptions of dreaming become the basis for the practice, which then allows you to realize non-dual awareness, right? The subject-object experiences and dreams, you use them. You don't dismiss or suppress them or inflate them. You use them. So in sexual yoga, you're doing that too. And as Nida points out, outside of sexual yoga context, it's very normal, required for male-bodied, conventionally karmically male-bodied lamas to visualize themselves as Vajra Yogini, Vajra Varahi as the Idam, and vice versa, female-bodied practitioners to imagine themselves as an opposite gender Buddha. But the reality is, if you understand deity yoga, meditational deities don't have gender in the way that human beings have gender. They have conventional symbolic appearances, which we use to dissolve any attachment to conventional dualism. So Nida explains very clearly that if you are transgender or gay, lesbian, whatever your sexual orientation might be, the point of the practice is you're using sexual stimulation and you're bringing it onto the path. So it would be silly for someone who's not attracted to the form, the sort of conventional form of a woman, to try to stimulate themselves by imagining, an imagined sexual partner in the shape of a woman, just because that's what the text says. So Nida makes this allowance, which I haven't seen many other lamas sort of be so explicit about, where he says, you use what works to create the conditions and the space which you're trying to cultivate as part of this meditative practice. The point of sexual yoga practice is to experience, in the deepest, most stable way, the utter inseparability of bliss and emptiness. Is to realize that you're using the arisings of bliss as a basis for meditation to realize their emptiness, just as you might realize the emptiness of sounds or shapes or any sensory arisings as well. Appear form and emptiness and form. This is sexual yoga. Is we're at the Heart Sutra here. It's the essence of the Buddha Dharma's teachings, and so you're beginning with something that starts with a lot of fixation and projection, and you're sort of hacking the same sort of attachments and dualistic investments that I think, no offense to anybody, some neo-tantric teachers, they're not really trying to undermine that. They're almost sort of elevating that. So there's really no reason that anyone who isn't able to experience sensory arisings can't do some level of these practices. Now, we do hear, especially in those life enhancement practices and other things, we do see in the tradition certain extremely advanced practices where yogis and yoginis are trained to absorb one another's mingled sexual fluids. And the tradition talks about consuming sexual fluids in a more literal fashion. And then one wonders how this would be, or whether this could be sort of moved out of a heteronormative context. Nida's feeling is sort of like, well, those practices developed in that heteronormative way, and so they can't sort of just be tweaked. They're specific to that. But as he also points out, there's no, sexual yoga incorporates much more than just that, right? Much more than just engagements with the sort of physical fact of sexual secretions of man or woman. And everybody's subtle body is perfect and complete in and of itself. It might be more difficult, some of the sexual yoga texts, this is where it gets really interesting. We could talk more in terms of the techniques, because there's a sort of recognition in the sexual yoga traditions that certain factors need to be there. So like if you have libido problems, or if there's damage to channels after childbirth, or if it's difficult for you to experience certain forms of stimulation or sensory pleasure because of psychological trauma, then you may not be a good candidate for these practices. Those methods, that type of kind of embodied engagement that is used as a form of meditation might not work best for you, or you might have to do additional work to kind of, and then maybe you do some other practice, right? You do some other discipline. So it really all depends on the individual. But I don't believe there's anything essentialized in the body of any practitioner that prevents them from experiencing bliss emptiness, because that's the nature of their mind, right? It's the nature of their awareness. So if we're talking in this really essentializing kind of reifying way, like, oh, you can't do this practice because you're a this or that. It's like the whole point is that the practice is taking you away from you're a this, you're a that thinking. So it's sort of a bit of a weird irony in a way. But anyway, I hope that answers the question.
That's so fascinating, Ben. So Dr. Ben Joffe, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.